If you're like most people that are looking to upgrade the performance of your old car, whether it's a fairly original stock build or a hot rod, you're probably mostly focused on the engine and the rest of the drivetrain. But don't forget, as you make that old pile faster, you still need to be able to slow it down. So keep that in mind while you're burning through your kid's college fund working on the go. Set a few bucks aside to work on the whoa. So in this video, I'm going to go over what I consider to be the top 5 brake options for your early Ford or hot rod build. Now these can either be an upgrade to your existing system if it's a car you already have and it's all together, or it could be an option for a build if you're building something from scratch. Now this is just going to cover hydraulic brakes. I'm not going to touch on mechanical brakes. I actually did a video all about mechanical brakes a while back as far as how they work and the different systems they had. But for this one, we're just going to focus on hydraulic brakes. Now this is entirely my opinion. Other people may have different opinions. Some people may like the systems that I don't and vice versa, and that's totally fine. This is just, from my experience, what I feel about these systems. So at the bottom of the list, number 5, is going to be your stock 39 to 48 Ford hydraulic brakes right here. Now if you've been following the channel at all, or if you did watch the mechanical brake video I did, you know I'm not really a big fan of these. I don't think they work that well. I don't think they're a very good design. But there are some upsides to these systems, and I'll go over all that right now. First off, let's look at the different systems they had. So the basic design of these was pretty much the same from 39 to 48. There were 2 different variations in the middle of that. So 39 through 41 actually had 2 more adjusters down here. This one right here, you can see, has a stud with a nut on it. These are actually cammed bolts. And as you twist the bolt itself, it rotates the cam and moves the shoe up and down to center it in the drum. In 42, for whatever reason, they did away with that. So this is the 42 to 48 style, and it just looks like a rivet here. There's no nut. Those are a fixed position for whatever reason. It seems to me like this design would have been better. They'd give you more adjustment to make them work better. For whatever reason, they decided that that wasn't the case. So the only adjustment you have here are these. Now the way these work is there's cams on the inside, as you can see right there. And as you rotate the bolt, both of them go out. So to tighten the shoes, to push the shoes out, it's not a lefty-loosey, righty-tighty thing. It's move the bolt out. So this one moves this way to tighten, this one moves this way to tighten. And that pushes on the side of the shoe and pushes it further into the drum. So if you're trying to get the drums off and need to loosen these up, both sides need to rotate in. So that's something to keep in mind. This one has to go in. This one has to go in. That's how you loosen them. So another difference is the 39 to 41s have different style clips. These are, I don't think they're welded on there. I'm not sure how they actually come off. Well, they may be welded on there. But the clips on these look like that. The 42 to 48s have a slide-in clip. This one's missing, but you can see the little hole here where the clip actually hooks into. Now the rear ones, on the early style like this, have a different clip still. So this one is larger to retain the parking brake pieces. Now the way you can tell the fronts from the rears is obviously this tube here for your parking brake cable. So if you're looking for a set of these, the rear ones you need a left and a right rear. The front ones interchange. Also, the rear ones can be run on the front if you just ignore that or cap it off. So let's touch on real quick why I don't like these. Well, first off, they're fixed. So the shoes aren't allowed to float at all. They're not self-adjusting. They're not self-energizing. All you have is the force from the piston pushing the shoe out into the drum, and that's it. So I don't think they work very well. Even when they're adjusted well, it's just not a good design. That being said, they are a very popular option because there's a lot of them around. It's what people were running back in the day, so it is very, traditionally correct, period correct for your build. And they will work on a lighter car especially. You don't need a ton of braking power to slow it down. So here's some things to look for and things to keep in mind if you decide you want to run this system. First off, especially in the rear, try to find a loaded backing plate like this. These things are pretty hard to find if you just buy a bare backing plate like this one is. Obviously this is a front, but the rear e-brake parts, the levers can be kind of hard to find. Another thing to keep in mind is on the earlier ones, like this, 39 to 41, I don't think you can buy these cam bolts. I know you can buy the cam itself, but I don't think they reproduce the bolts. So if you're missing those, now you have to track those down as well, and that's an additional expense on top of your backing plates. You can buy new shoes for these. There's mixed reviews as to how well they work, and they're not very cheap. You can buy new wheel cylinders. Again, there's been issues with them, and they're $35 or $40 a piece now, I think. Another downfall to this system, in my opinion, is, like all early brakes, is the fact that the drum is swedged onto the hub. So if you want to replace your drum, you have to cut the studs off, cut the swedge off, and you can have them re-swedged, or you can just change the studs and have them slip on, which is preferable in my opinion. So this is a rear hub. The drum has obviously been removed from, I think this is actually a Lincoln, but they're pretty much the same as a Ford. But now you can just have a slip-on drum. You can buy the drums new. I know Speedway and a lot of other retailers do sell new drums, but I think they're like $125 a piece, so they're definitely not cheap. If you can find good used ones and have them machined, it's certainly a cheaper option. So just for a quick recap on my number 5 option, it's 39 to 48 Ford stock hydraulic brakes. Again, I'm not a big fan of these, but they are pretty easy to find. They made millions and millions of those cars. You can find the backing plates at swap meets pretty easily. I have probably 50 sets of them here. And it certainly fits the bill if you're looking to do a period correct build from the 40s or 50s. So let's move on to number 4. Now I don't have the example here to show you, unfortunately, but I'll discuss why I picked it and what it is. So number 4 is what's called F2 brakes. So 48 to 52 Ford pickups. They had F1s, F2s, F3s, etc. F2 and F3s are like a 3/4 and 1 ton type truck. They actually ran a 12-inch Bendix style brake. So they're really similar in design to the early Lincoln brakes, and a lot of guys will run them with the aluminum 45 fin Buick drums. So it's a good working system. I think you can run a 2-inch wide shoe on that. They're good drums. It's a good stopping system. The problem is now that stuff is all getting really hard to find. They do reproduce the aluminum drums, but they're like $300 a piece. Finding used ones is pretty tough. Even finding the F2 backing plates is getting pretty tough. So while it is a cool option, it's not feasible unless you want to spend a lot of money or spend a long time hunting for all these parts. So number 3 on the list is early Lincoln brakes. Starting in '39, just like Ford, Lincoln went to a hydraulic brake system, but they actually went to a good hydraulic brake system. They used Bendix brakes instead of Lockheed brakes. Bendix brakes are a similar design to what modern, well, I say modern, but newer vehicles that had drum brakes still. It's a similar design to that. Bendix brakes use a self-energizing shoe, so the shoes are allowed to float. It's a much better design than the Lockheed system. The strange thing with Lincoln is that they kept changing throughout the years. So while Ford was pretty similar in their fitment from 39 to 48 as far as the offset of the backing plates and the style of the drums, they all interchange. Lincoln decided they just wanted to keep changing it. So there was actually 3 different designs of Lincoln brakes from 39 to 48 as far as the offset of the backing plate and the style of the drum goes. I have 2 of those here, so we'll take a look at those. So as I mentioned, there were 3 different offsets of Lincoln backing plates. I only have 2 here. 1940 was one style. It had a very, very deep offset. I'm assuming 39 was the same. I don't know. I know the drums were different because 39 was still wide 5. But you see the real deep offset of this. This was, again, either 40 or 39 and 40. These do not fit on Ford spindles unless you build a spacer for it. They run into the kingpins, they run into the top of the spindle. It's not a direct bolt-on for it. And one other note with the 39 and 40 backing plates is that they still have the old, smaller bolt pattern like Ford used pre-37. I have no idea why they stuck with this for longer than Ford did, but this is the smaller bolts and the more narrow pattern. So starting in 41, they used a much shallower backing plate, which I do not have any of, but they were the same offset as a Ford backing plate. So a 41 plate will bolt on to a Ford spindle, and you can use a Ford drum, and that's it. There's no modification, there's no fabrication, they're just bolt on and run. But it's 41 only. So in 42, they decided to go back to a deeper offset. Now the offset is less than the 40 style, but it's still too much to fit on a Ford spindle. So same deal, a lot of guys will make a spacer and push this out so that it'll fit and clear the kingpin and work with your drums and everything. So that's an option. You can do that with them, but it's not a direct bolt-on. The only direct bolt-on for Lincoln brakes is 41. Now that being said, the rear brakes are all the same and are the same as Ford. So any rear backing plate from a 39 to 48 Lincoln will fit on the front or rear of a Ford because they have the same offset. I have no idea why they kept changing the front, but the back ones are all the same. So you can always use the back one, plug off what they have for an opening for the e-brake cable, and you can make them work on the front. So if that's not confusing enough, let's look at the drums that go along with those. So the front drums, there were 3 different ones obviously to match the 3 different offsets of backing plates. So up here is essentially a flat drum. There's really no step to it to speak of. That's a 41 that matches the most shallow backing plate. Now it's worth noting that Lincoln spindles are also entirely different than Ford. The kingpin's different, they're set up entirely different, so you can't just swap spindles either. So then the 42 to 48 drum has a bigger offset, you can see here. And then the biggest offset is the 40 drum to match those really offset backing plates. So to make it even more confusing, the 40 front drum is the same as all of the rear drums. However, the 40 front backing plates don't fit, but the rears do, if that makes any sense. So if you're at swap meets looking for this stuff, write some notes down, bring them with you, because you can pretty easily get confused and buy the wrong stuff. So now let's talk parts availability. So they do reproduce all these brakes now, so I'm pretty sure you can buy all the stuff new, shoes, hoses, wheel cylinders, all that jazz. Same thing with the drums, at least for the 40 style. The 41 style and the 42 to 48 style, I don't believe you can buy drums for. But the 40 style is the same as Ford. So I know Speedway sells reproduction drums, Bowling Brothers, a few other places probably sell them. But again, it's the same issue with the Fords, is that they're swedged onto the hub. So you need to cut the swedge off, cut the studs out, and either have them re-swedged or, again, just put studs in so you can slide the drum on. So for a quick recap on the number 3 option, it's early Lincoln brakes. So the benefits to these brakes is that, as I mentioned, they're a Bendix style brake. They work a lot better than the Lockheeds. The downside is that they're fairly expensive to get reproduction parts for, and if you want to run original backing plates like these, they're getting really hard to find. So number 2 on the list is going to be F1 truck brakes. Now the F1, as I mentioned, is 48 to 52 Ford pickups, half ton only. So these right here are actually F100 brakes, even though they're almost identical. The only real difference is the offset in the hub. F1 brakes, for whatever reason, have a little bit more of an offset, so the drum has a little bit more of a kick in it. Now again, these are a Bendix style brake. They're self-energizing, so they're a much better braking system. One of the downsides to these, though, is that they're only 11-inch. They still work just fine, but if you're looking for kind of the look to fill in the back of the wheel, if you're running a 16-inch wheel, it's an inch smaller now, and it kind of gives them more of a gap looking at it from the back side, if that bothers you. But for me, the benefits to these systems far outweigh the fact that it may not be as aesthetically pleasing as the early Lincoln or early Ford brakes. So the number 1 thing for me on these brakes is the fact that they already have a separate hub and a separate drum. They weren't swedged together like the earlier brakes were. So that's a huge plus. You don't have to mess around with replacing wheel studs. The drums come right off. You don't have to pull the hub off to check the brakes. Obviously, another benefit is the brake system itself. And the F100 and F1 brakes are essentially the same internals. You can actually make them self-adjusting too. If you pick up a hardware kit for, I believe it's a 65 F100, they started using self-adjusting setups. And all of that will fit in here. So now you have self-energizing and self-adjusting brakes. So essentially you'll set it once and not have to worry about it anymore. All the parts are available. They're relatively affordable. The only reason I separated the F1 brakes from the F100 brakes are because they use a different drum. The F1 brakes, because it was only a 4-year thing, obviously they don't sell a lot of them. The drums are pretty expensive. You can buy reproductions. I think they're like $130 or $140 for a drum, unfortunately. The rest of the internals, as I mentioned, are all the same as the later trucks. So that's the reason that I put F1s in their own category and a step down. All right, so that's our number 2 option, is 48 to 52 Ford pickup F1 brakes. So as I mentioned, all the replacement parts are readily available. The downside is the drums are kind of pricey. These things are pretty easy to find. There's still a lot of guys building street rods out of those trucks, putting the disc brakes and the independent front suspension and all that stuff in it. And a lot of times you can get these setups super cheap. Sometimes you can get them recently rebuilt for really cheap. So it's certainly a great option if you're on a budget and you're not looking for that 1940s period correct stuff. So now it's time for my number one pick on brake upgrades. There's actually two number ones. The reason I did that is because it's kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. So the first number one is going to be the F100 brakes. That's going to be 1953 to 1956 F100 pickup. They're almost identical to the F1 brakes aside from the offset of the hub. So the drums are different, the hubs are different. You cannot mix and match them. You need to use F1 parts with the F1 and F100 parts with the F100s. The reason I separated the F1 brakes from the F100 brakes is because of the availability of drums. So the 53 to 56 F100s use the same brake drum that Ford kept using right up through 66. So there's a huge range of years there. There's a bunch of different manufacturers. They're really cheap, easy to find. So instead of paying $125 or $140 for a drum, you can get them for like $30 or $40. As I mentioned, all the rest of the hardware is the same. If you order a hardware kit for a 65 or 66 F100, you can now get self-adjusting brakes, which is even better. So realistically, for a budget build or anything that you're not going full on period correct with, I think that's the number one option. They're a great braking system, they work really well, parts are readily available. The one thing you will need to bolt those hubs onto Ford spindles is the inner bearing is actually larger. You can actually use F100 and F1 spindles on an early Ford axle. The steering arms are kind of funky though, so it's more trouble than it's worth. Speedway sells a inner bearing kit that adapts the F100 and F1 hubs to your early Ford spindles, so it's as simple as just changing out the bearings and races. Then it just all goes together and it's ready to go. The only modification you have to do to your spindle is if you're running round back spindles, you need to grind the top of the round part down. If you're running square back spindles, which are the 42 to 48s, they slip right on and there's no interference issues at all. So what's the other number one? Well, on the opposite end of the spectrum is going to be the reproduction brakes. So there's companies like Bowling Brothers and obviously Speedway, and there may be other places by now that reproduce the early Lincoln brakes. So again, it's all new parts, new drums, new hubs, new shoes, everything's new. You don't have to worry about the hassle of going to swap meets, trying to piece this stuff together, trying to find good original backing plates that aren't all beat up or rusted. So if you have deep pockets and an unlimited budget, that is my number one option for you. The downside is that for the rest of us, that stuff is super expensive. So you can buy them in complete kits, and I don't remember what the whole kit goes for. So just looking at the individual pieces, the loaded backing plates I think are $250 to $300 a piece. The hubs are $200 a piece. The drums are like $125 a piece. So right there you're talking, say, $550 on the backing plates, another $400 for the hubs, that's $950, $250 for the drums, and that's just for one axle. You know, you have to do both axles, you're talking quite a bit of cash. So I will bring up one of the downsides of using the F100 and F1 brakes is that obviously those are just for the fronts. If you're running a stock banjo rear end, the F1 brakes aren't going to work on the rear of that. You have to run either early Lincoln or early Ford style hydraulic brakes for that. So hopefully you found this helpful. If you have any other questions or comments, if you think there's any other systems that maybe I should have included in the list, go ahead and throw that down in the comments. I'll check that out. Also, take a hop on over to my video list there, check out what's on there. There may be some other videos you want to check out that you haven't yet. So as always, thank you for watching. Give the video a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and we'll see you on the next one.